Welcome back to TECHMIMIC, where you can simply view, imitate, replicate, and get on with your day. In this tutorial, we're going to resize a Linux partition without going into too much technical detail. We will look at reducing the size of the partition, so shrinking, and then extend the size of the partition. And we will do this for a live or running Linux system. Although I'm showing this on Linux Mint, it will be the exact same thing, or at least very similar, for any Linux distribution, Debian or Ubuntu based. This is because the same programs and command line utilities will be used, and I will show an example for Debian. If you would like to see this demonstrated on a different Linux distribution altogether, or there is any disk or partition related task for which you would like to see a video, please leave a comment. To study the available partitions and their size, in Linux Mint we can open the menu, then click Preferences, and then Disks. In my machine there is only one physical hard disk, so let's click it on the left hand side, and this will open the partition information. This is a 240 GB SSD drive, and there are 3 partitions. We will skip the 2 small partitions and focus on the biggest one, labeled as partition 3. At the bottom, under Device, this partition is known to Linux as dev SDA3, so let's make a note of this for later on. Visually, because the first 2 partitions are so small, it looks like partition 3 is using the entire space. In that regard, the graphical representation of the size of the partitions is not proportional at all. The next steps are completely optional, but I would like to show you a couple of commands that you can run from the terminal to get more information. Again, without too much technical explanation to keep the video pragmatic. We will return to the graphical interface shortly. So open a terminal, and to show the size of the partition and the amount of space used versus the available space, type df-h and then the path to the partition. So in this case, /dev for device /SDA3. The size is 219 GB with 23 GB used. This results in a utilization of 11%. The file system is mounted as the root file system, indicated by the / character. Another command is the lsblk command. This will show similar information, presented in a different way, especially when adding the -f option, lsblk-f. I have no doubt that by now you will have noticed small differences in the reported size and utilization between the various commands and the earlier graphical disks program. You can safely ignore this for now, as long as you know the general partition size, you should be alright. Then there is sudo fdisk-l, and this will look very similar to the earlier disks program, but now presented in text. And the last command is sudo parted-l. Again, very similar. You don't need any of the commands or even the terminal at all, but I wanted to show it to you just for future reference and maybe some background information. When I've installed Linux Mint, I've allocated all the available space, and now let's say I would like to reduce the size of this partition for some reason. If now we would like to work with partition number 3, we can click it and then click the gear or settings icon. From there are many things in the list to select from, but today we would like to resize. When selected, this brings up the Resize Volume dialog. The term volume and partition are sometimes used interchangeably. Please note that resizing a file system can lead to data loss, so always make sure you have proper backups in place. The partition size is currently 240 GB, using up all the space. There are 2 ways to change the size. In this case, we would like to reduce it with 50 GB, but of course adjust accordingly. By simply typing 50 for free space following, the difference will be -50 GB. This of course makes sense. The new partition size is calculated, and this will be 190 GB. Also note that the slider will follow the changes. This is the second way of doing this without typing any numbers, but by just moving the slider around. When I change 50 to 100, the slider will follow. Notice, however, that we cannot apply any changes, because if we click the Resize button and provide a password, it reports an error while unmounting the file system with a description of target is busy. And this is very logical, because the actual partition we are trying to resize is the so-called root partition. Remember the /, and that will always be active whenever Linux Mint is active. The disks utility we are looking at now is available in Linux Mint, Debian and Ubuntu, and it will work exactly the same. What I would like to do now is to install another utility, which is a utility that is available for working with disks for various different operating systems. And I'm sure you will add this to your toolbox after you've seen this video. I could have skipped the disks utility completely, but again I wanted to provide some background information to you to see how the utility called GParted is, in my personal opinion, more powerful and easier to handle. Also, it will have the same interface across the board, and on top of that it can do things for you that disks simply can't. Open the software manager and search for the program GParted and install it. Once it is installed, find it in the menu under Administration and then GParted. And there it is. This time around it's actually clear in the size of the blocks or squares that partition 1 and partition 2 are very small. Also, the partitions on the only SSD in this system were automatically opened, but make sure that you have selected the correct disk if there are more than one in the top right corner. The third partition is of course still dev SDA3, and the size, used and unused space are clearly visible. And the icon of the small lock means we won't be able to resize it, for the same reasons as shown earlier while the Linux system is loaded. When the partition is right-clicked and the resize move is selected, a similar dialog opens. Once again you can enter a number manually or move the slider. This time however it is in megabytes and not in gigabytes. So let's get the calculator out. We would like to reduce with 50 gigabytes, which is 50 times 1024 megabytes, which equals 51,200 megabytes. So the new size will become the existing size, 228421, minus 51200, which is 177221. Type in this number in the new size field. However, as expected, also this won't work. The free space following field is not updated, the resize button is disabled, and also the slider is not available. At least this time it didn't allow us to try it anyway, to only report a possibly confusing error message. So, if the lock icon indicates we can't resize this partition, how do we resize it while Linux is not loaded? For this we need the exact same program, GParted, which by the way stands for GNOME Partition Editor. So let's go to the website gparted.org. There, GParted is described as a free partition editor for graphically managing your disks and partitions, and is available for Linux, Windows and Mac. That's why this is a great tool to have. It works everywhere and it always looks the same. GParted is very powerful and we are only scratching the surface here with a partition resize. Click download, where it highlights that the best way to access all of the features of the GParted application is by using the GParted Live Image, and that's what we will have to use too. You can study the architecture description, but for most users it will just be the AMD64.iso file that is needed, so the top one in the list. Click it. The SourceForge website is a bit busy, just ignore everything and wait for the download to start and then finish. The size should be around 550 megabytes. Once you have downloaded the image, it's time to create the installation media by flashing this image to a USB stick, from which we're going to boot into GParted to resize the partition that is currently locked. At this point, connect your USB stick to your machine. In Linux Mint, there is a standard utility that is simply called USB Image Writer, to be found in the menu under Accessories and then USB Image Writer. Pretty much every Linux distribution includes a USB Image Writer by default, but creating the actual bootable USB stick is not the purpose of this video. There are loads and loads of tutorials already on YouTube. Just select the GParted Live Image ISO. Make very sure to select the correct USB drive to avoid any data loss. Click Write and wait for it to finish. Once you have your USB drive ready, you are all set to boot from it. Now leave your USB drive into your machine, or place it in any machine where you would like to resize a partition in, and reboot or start the system. You might need to enter your BIOS or UEFI settings to change the boot order. Look for a prompt during startup that tells you how to enter setup. Usually it's a key like F2, delete or escape. Once there, set your USB drive as the first boot device, save the changes and exit. If you are using virtual machines, make sure that your VM is booting from the ISO image. And as promised earlier, it looks the same across the Debian and Ubuntu-based Linux distributions. Here is GParted on a Debian desktop, and here is the USB image writer utility on the same Debian desktop. Anyway, after booting from the USB drive, you will see the very colorful GParted boot menu. Just hit enter to accept the default settings, and wait a few moments while ignoring the on-screen messages. We are almost there. I opt to leave my keyboard mapping alone, so I will leave the don't touch key map and again hit enter. Now it asks what keyboard language I prefer. The default is 33, which is US English, and that's fine, so enter again. At this point you can try different settings if it doesn't start a graphical environment in the next step, but again the default 0 is fine, enter again. Wait once again, and there it is, a graphical environment with Debian and the available options. If things are hard to see, try to play around with the screen resolution. For now, simply start GParted, and no surprises here, the exact same interface as before, so we now know what to do. The small lock or key icon is gone, so we can resize the root partition now without any issues. Right click the partition, select Resize Move, and make the required adjustments. Once again, you can enter a number manually or move the slider. Then click Resize Move. This will leave 50 GB of unallocated space. Nothing is happening just yet, and this is by design. You can make multiple changes at once and then apply them all at the same time. For example, you can also now create a new partition in the now available space. But we are ready, so click the green checkmark icon. And we are sure we would like to apply the pending operations. Click Apply. GParted will now start its magic, and depending on your situation, this can take a short or longer time. In this case, it's very short, but I had machines where the resize took about 20 minutes. Just be patient and you can check on the progress with the details option that is available. It indicates that dev SDA3 has successfully been reduced in size to 173.07, so minus 50 GB as requested. You can now click Close, exit GParted, click Exit, and select Reboot. Remove the USB stick from your machine and boot back into Linux Mint. From there, for fun, let's use the disks utility. And there the changes are indeed visible, including the new free space. And completely optional, let's have a look at the earlier terminal commands to see the new and reduced size of the file system. As I'm sure by now, your new favorite tool is GParted. So let's start GParted. I hope you can now see what I meant earlier. GParted always looks the same. It's very consistent in any operating system, or even when started from the live bootable image. You can simply create a new partition by right-click the unallocated space, select New and fill in the numbers. But now for an example where you want to extend the root file system and there is unallocated free space available. Extending a locked file system can actually be done, and it is allowed while Linux is running. Right click, resize and move, extend the slider all the way and click resize. Apply the changes by clicking the green check mark and it's already done. The partition size has grown from 173.07 GB to 223.07 GB. And then remember that if you want to reduce it again, that is actually not allowed while Linux is running, only extending is allowed. So for that, you would need to repeat the USB Live bootable image method again. That's it. Hope it helped, and if it did, please like the video and keep it up. Until next time, bye!